It was just announced this week that The Batman 2 is set to release in 2025. One thing I quickly realized about the significance of that year is that it's also going to be the 30th anniversary of Batman Forever. Now I know what you're thinking. Batman Forever? Who cares? That movie sucked. True, and while it's not god-awful like its successor, it definitely has not aged well. What a lot of people don't realize is that Tim Burton was originally supposed to direct the film as the third and final chapter of his take on the Caped Crusader. While he did receive producer credits for laying the groundwork for the movie itself, it would ultimately be the late Joel Schumacher that would take the helm on Batman Forever and its follow-up. As many of you know, Tim Burton was selected in the late 80s to produce The Dark Knight's big screen debut. Batman, or Batman 89 as it's now referred to, was released in the summer of '89, starring Michael Keaton. Needless to say, it was a huge critical and commercial success, so naturally Warner Brothers greenlit 2 more sequels for Tim Burton to direct. 3 years later, the summer of 1992 brought us Batman Returns, and while this was also a great movie despite its many flaws, it didn't quite make as much money at the box office, but was still a commercial success. The film also had a much darker tone due to Burton having complete freedom on the project with no restrictions from the studio. Unfortunately, many parents complained that the film was too disturbing for kids, as well as backlash from McDonald's claiming that their Happy Meal toys promoting the film weren't kid-friendly. So when it came to start production on the third film of the trilogy, the Warner Brothers executives tried to convince Mr. Burton on making a different film instead. Quickly realizing that the studio did not want him involved in the project, he stepped down along with Michael Keaton exiting the role of Batman. The possibility of a third Batman movie directed by Tim Burton to this day remains one of the biggest what-ifs in cinema history. And while there is somewhat of an official continuation of the Burtonverse in the form of a 6-part comic series entitled Batman 89, personally, it just wasn't my cup of tea. But today, here at Mag Gear Arcade, we're here to explain our concept for Batman Continues, the original title of the supposed third film in Mr. Burton's trilogy, here on this edition of Dreamcasting. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Tim Burton laid the groundwork for what would eventually become Batman Forever. However, his choices for casting the new characters debuting in the film were a bit different from what we got in Schumacher's version. Robin Williams was originally planned to portray the Riddler, Billy D. Williams was said to be reprising his role as Harvey Two-Face Dent from Batman 89, and get this, Marlon Wayans as Robin? I don't know, the previous 2 castings are perfect, but even in 2023, I can't picture Marlon Wayans in a serious role. And also, all of these actors are much older now or have passed on at this point. So the only way a project like this would be able to come to life is if it were an animated or CG film, with the OG actors returning to provide the voices of their respective characters. But without further ado, let's get to Dreamcasting Batman Continues. Starting off with the OGs, we have Michael Keaton returning as Batman, Michelle Pfeiffer returning for a cameo scene as Catwoman, and Billy D. Williams as Two-Face. Now for the debuting characters, starting with Robin, I was originally thinking of bringing back Chris O'Donnell since I thought he did a decent job back in the day, at least with what he was given, but then I had a better idea. Since it would be an animated film, have him voiced by Scott Mensville. That's right, the voice of Robin from Teen Titans, the badass Robin from the OG series and not that silly new shit on Cartoon Network today. Next up is the Riddler, and as much as I love Jim Carrey's campy take on the character back in the 90s, it just doesn't work in the Burtonverse. Again, Mr. Burton originally wanted Robin Williams to play the role of Edward Nashton. Yeah, that's right, it's Nashton in the comics and not Nigma. Now, sadly, Robin Williams passed away in 2014. However, a piece of test footage from a potential biopic of him from a year or 2 ago shows actor Jamie Costa doing a spot-on impression of the late actor. So why not get him to voice the Riddler instead? Finally, we have a small role from the Scarecrow, who was supposed to be the third villain in Tim Burton's original version. I think Cillian Murphy, who played Dr. Jonathan Crane in the Dark Knight trilogy, is a safe and sure casting. And finally, here's a rough draft of the opening scene I came up with in my head. We start off with the WB logo and Danny Elfman's iconic score before the skies darken, and the view pans lower onto a slum neighborhood of Gotham City amidst a thunderstorm. Inside one of the houses is a young Edward Nashton, sketching alphanumeric codes on his walls, and in the background is a neon light sign with the phrase, "Smarts and Skills." The boy is shaken and almost possessed by the codes, while shouting can be heard in the kitchen between his parents, before the sounds of smacking, breaking of objects, and the mother's screams. It's clear that she's being abused, and that there is no love between the two. Eventually, in his drunken rage, the father breaks into Edward's room and is irate to find the walls littered with codes. He grabs the boy by the throat, holding him against the wall, and using his survival instincts, Edward grabs a curved metal rod on the desk that resembles a sickle and strikes his father, forcing him to let go and writhe in pain on the floor. Overwhelmed with a sense of power and control for the first time in his life, he walks over to his fallen father, whom his whole life he resented and was the source of a lifelong misery, before repeatedly beating him over the head with it. The camera shifts back to the wall of codes, where blinding lightning strikes outside continuously out the window, as splashes of blood hit the wall on the writing. Next, the camera shifts back to Edward rising up. Now consumed with unquenched rage, he begins to strike the walls blindly, screaming, and only after his room is in shambles does he calm down and walk out. The camera moves in the opposite direction, closing in on the now damaged neon sign, now only illuminating the words, "Art kills." Edward approaches his mother in the living room, who is too shaken to process anything at this point, and pretends to comfort her, calming her down by covering her eyes before raising the sickle over his head and delivering multiple blows to her head as he sports a deranged smile. Once his parents were both dead, he walks away from the apartment now, outside in the pouring rain, sporting tears and laughter of both joy. He runs down the street, finally free of all misery. Meanwhile, in the apartment, the camera moves across the floor, returning to the metal sickle, which now has a drop of blood next to it, resembling a question mark, before Danny Elfman's score builds up and the title graphic, "Batman Continues," appears. And that's what I've got so far. If you want to hear more, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Until then, later days!